There is a stretch of farmland in the south of England where, almost every summer for 50 years, farmers have woken up to find their fields rearranged overnight. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Rearranged into circles, spirals, and geometric shapes so precise they look drawn with a ruler, pressed into standing wheat with no footprints leading in and none leading out. For decades we called it a prank. 2 men, a plank of wood, a length of rope, and a long night. Case closed. But what happens when you take every crop circle ever photographed, thousands of them, spanning half a century, and instead of laughing at them, you actually measure them? What happens when you hand that pile of images to a machine that has no opinion about aliens, no fear of looking foolish, and no interest in a good story? A machine that only cares about pattern. That is exactly what a small group of independent researchers experimenting with modern image recognition (AI) decided to try. And what came back was not a punchline. It was a curve. A slow, steady, unmistakable climb in complexity, stretching across 5 decades, that nobody, hoaxer or believer, has ever been able to fully explain. This is the story of that curve, and where it might be pointing next. Before we get to what the AI found, it's worth being honest about what this actually was, because that matters. This wasn't a government program. It wasn't a peer-reviewed scientific paper, with a press conference behind it. It was a handful of people with access to a capable image analysis model, and a simple question: is there any real structure hiding inside crop circle designs? Or have we all just been staring at random human vandalism for 50 years and calling it a mystery, because mysteries are more fun than vandalism? To find out, they built an archive, thousands of crop circle photographs pulled from newspaper morgues, field research societies, aerial photography collections, and amateur archives that crop circle enthusiasts have quietly maintained since the late 1970s. Each image came with whatever metadata could be attached to it: the country it appeared in, the rough date, the crop type, and, where it was known, whether that particular formation had later been claimed by a human artist or group. The instructions given to the model were kept deliberately plain. Look at the shapes. Find any structure. Report whether there's a pattern across time, or whether the whole set is just noise dressed up as folklore. No mention of aliens. No mention of messages. No framing at all, really, beyond these are geometric formations that appeared in fields, tell us what you see. The point of stripping out all the mythology was simple. A model that has no stake in the outcome can't be accused of wanting the mystery to be real. It doesn't hope for anything. It just counts, measures, and compares. Nobody on the team expected fireworks. The two boring, sensible outcomes everyone quietly predicted were either that the shapes would turn out to be statistically random, exactly what you'd expect from decades of unrelated people making unrelated circles with no coordination between them, or that there'd be a little repetition. A handful of favorite motifs recycled over and over, the geometric equivalent of everyone doodling the same 5-point star. Either result would have let the story die a quiet, satisfying death. Instead, what came back was a trend line. Not a flat one. Not a jagged, random one. A line that rose, gently at first and then less gently, across 50 years of summers. The humble beginning, roughly 3 to 7 o'clock. To understand why a rising line matters, you have to start where the whole phenomenon started. A quiet corner of Wiltshire, England, in the late 1970s, in farmland that already carried an enormous amount of history. This is the same region that holds Stonehenge, Avebury, and dozens of ancient burial mounds. A landscape people have been marking with circles and standing stones for thousands of years, long before anyone was flattening wheat. So when farmers in this same stretch of countryside began finding fresh circles pressed into their fields, there was already a strange sense of déjà vu in the air, as if the land itself had a habit of being drawn on. The earliest formations were almost laughably plain by later standards, a single circle, nothing more. No rings around it, no attached shapes, no symmetry to speak of. Just a smooth, swirled patch of flattened crop sitting in an otherwise ordinary field, discovered at dawn with the dew still resting on the bent stalks. There was no sound reported, no lights, no witnesses. The circle was simply there in the morning where it hadn't been the evening before. And because it was so simple, people explained it away easily: a stray whirlwind, a strange gust dropping out of a storm system, deer trampling in a ring while chasing each other, or just the field settling oddly after heavy rain. A few older locals mentioned half-remembered folklore about rings appearing in grass, but nobody took it seriously enough to write it down properly. It was a fence post conversation, not a headline. When the AI worked back through this earliest batch of images, decades later, and with no memory of how unremarkable they'd seemed at the time, it scored them almost uniformly low on every complexity measure it was tracking. And that makes sense on its own terms. Mathematically, a circle is about as simple as a shape gets. One center point, one consistent radius, one unbroken curve. There's almost nothing to it structurally. If you were building up a visual vocabulary from scratch, whether by human hand or by something else entirely, a single circle is close to where you'd have to start. Not because it's mysterious, but because it's the simplest mark available. What makes this part of the story worth telling at all is what happened next, because the shapes didn't stay simple. The shapes start talking, roughly 7 to 11 o'clock. If crop circles had stayed single plane rings for 50 years, there would be no video to make about them. A recurring simple shape has boring, satisfying explanations. Wind can flatten a circle. An animal on a tether walking in loops can flatten a circle. A bored group of people with a plank and a rope can absolutely flatten a circle. What none of those explanations account for nearly as comfortably is a shape that gets steadily more sophisticated, year after year, in a consistent direction, as if whoever or whatever is making them is working through a curriculum rather than repeating a trick. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, that's precisely what the fields began to show. The lone circle started gathering company. Instead of one ring sitting by itself in the middle of a field, multiple circles began appearing together, and not scattered randomly, but arranged with clear relationships to one another. A large central circle would show up flanked by smaller circles spaced evenly around it, like a diagram someone had sketched out in advance. The formations grew bigger and, frankly, more confident. They stopped looking like accidents and started looking like decisions. Put yourself at the edge of one of those fields as a farmer in, say, 1982. You can talk yourself into believing one circle is the wind. It's a lot harder to talk yourself into believing that 4 evenly spaced circles arranged in a deliberate row down your barley field are the wind. Your brain starts reaching for a different word: someone. Someone planned this. And that word carries its own unease, because nobody had actually seen a someone. Nobody had heard footsteps, engines, voices. And critically, the fields showed no trampled path showing how a someone could have walked in, built something that precise, and walked back out without leaving a trace through the standing crop. The RE's complexity scores tracked this shift closely. Numbers that had sat near zero throughout the late 1970s began climbing steadily through the early 1980s. Rings nested within rings. Circles connected by narrow corridors of flattened crop. The first real hints of symmetry: a left side answering a right side, a top balancing a bottom. In the language the researchers eventually settled on, these weren't single letters anymore. They were short words. And the rise wasn't occasional or scattered, it was directional. On average, each year's most intricate formation was a little more intricate than the previous year's best. Slowly, and with a kind of patience that some of the researchers found genuinely unsettling once they sat with the numbers, the shapes in the fields were saying more with each passing season. The aerial perspective problem, roughly 11 to 3 p.m. By the mid-1980s, the geometry had hardened into something nobody could reasonably wave off as coincidence anymore. Smaller circles weren't just floating near larger ones, they were physically joined to them by narrow flattened corridors, forming shapes that looked like keys, dumbbells, or symbols pulled from an alphabet nobody had ever been taught. Concentric rings appeared with edges so clean that standing at the boundary, you could put one foot on upright wheat, and the other on flattened wheat with barely a hand's width of transition between them. No gradual crushing. No ragged edge fading from vertical to horizontal. Just a line, and on either side of it, the crop followed a completely different rule. This is also roughly when photographers started renting light aircraft, because it had become obvious these designs weren't meant to be appreciated from the ground. Standing at the edge of a field, all a farmer could really see was a confusing sprawl of bent stalks, an impression of damage with no obvious shape to it. But lift the same field 200 feet into the air, and the sprawl resolves into something balanced, centered, and clearly composed for a viewer looking straight down. That detail troubled the research team more than almost anything else in the early data. Whoever, or whatever, was making these formations was designing them for an aerial vantage point that no person walking through a dark field at night could have used to check their own work. Running back through the image metadata, the AI kept flagging the same observation: the designs weren't repeating themselves. A hoaxer, even a skilled and dedicated one, tends to lean on a signature move, a favorite trick that's already been proven to work. But the formations from this period rarely just copied what came before. Instead, they built on it. A ring structure from one summer would reappear the following summer with an added layer of symmetry, a small refinement, one more piece bolted on. It read less like someone doodling the same shape repeatedly, and more like a student turning in progressively harder assignments, each one showing that the last lesson had actually landed. Media circus and the missed signal, roughly 15 to 5 p.m. Once newspapers caught wind of the phenomenon, it stopped being a rural curiosity and became a full-blown national story in Britain, then an international one. Aerial photographs ran across full newspaper pages. Reporters camped out in Wiltshire at dawn hoping to be first to a fresh formation. And with the press attention came the theories, all competing loudly for the same headline space: landing marks from something otherworldly on one side, an elaborate long-running countryside prank on the other. The 1990 jump, roughly 17 to 9 p.m. Up to this point in the data, the story the researchers were tracking was one of patient, incremental growth, a little more symmetry each year, one more ring, a slightly steadier hand. You could squint at that curve and imagine a slow human apprenticeship, people quietly getting better at a craft over a decade. But when the calendar rolled into 1990, the curve stopped behaving like an apprenticeship. It leapt. The team gave this jump a plain, deliberately unglamorous name: the complexity threshold. Everything before it clustered in a fairly tight band, 3, 4, occasionally 5 distinct elements, arranged carefully, but well within what a patient, skilled team with rope and boards could plausibly pull off in a long summer night. The formations that began appearing around 1990 didn't sit anywhere near that band. Some carried 15 or more distinct elements. Nested shapes locked inside other nested shapes, each holding a precise angular relationship to the one before it, with symmetry maintained across an entire field, and no measurable drift, no spot where the design quietly got sloppy in a corner nobody was likely to check closely. What struck the researchers even more than the size of the jump was its shape on the graph. A gradual improvement would show up as a curve, a handful of transitional years where designs are noticeably better than before, but not yet at the new level, a visible bridge between the old band and the new one. The data simply didn't contain that bridge. The transition looked almost vertical. One season, the fields were working with something like short simple phrases. The very next season, they were producing dense, interlocking paragraphs of geometry, as if the in-between steps had never been necessary at all. And the detail that made the room go quiet, according to accounts from people involved in the project, was that this leap didn't stay local. If one especially talented team in Wiltshire had simply figured out a new technique, you'd expect that sophistication to show up there first and then spread outward gradually, turning up months or years later in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the American Midwest, in Australian wheat fields. That's how human skill normally travels, unevenly, from a source, over time. Instead, formations crossing this new complexity threshold started showing up across multiple countries within roughly the same narrow window, in fields separated by oceans and languages, and every practical barrier that should have slowed a shared technique from spreading that fast. After 1990, the researchers found something else worth flagging honestly: the rate of increase had itself increased. Complexity hadn't just jumped once and plateaued, it kept climbing, and it climbed faster than it had before the jump. On the graph, a hill had become something closer to a wall.